The world watched in horror. On November 1, 2024, the unthinkable happened. President Biden, in a move that shocked even his closest allies, authorized Ukraine to strike targets within Russia itself. This was no ordinary escalation. This was a dangerous gamble, a roll of the dice that could plunge the world into a nuclear abyss. The decision, announced quietly amidst a flurry of other news, sent shockwaves across the globe. For months, Ukraine had pleaded for long-range missiles, weapons capable of hitting Russian soil. For months, the US had resisted, fearing an uncontrollable escalation. Now, it seemed, those fears had been cast aside. The implications were clear. The line between supporting Ukraine and actively engaging Russia had been blurred, perhaps even erased. The Kremlin, already spoiling for a fight, would see this as a direct attack by the United States. The consequences, everyone agreed, could be catastrophic. The world braced itself. The question was no longer if Russia would retaliate, but how and when. Across the Atlantic, the mood was a mixture of apprehension and grim determination. Biden's decision, while controversial, had emboldened America's allies. The United Kingdom, under the leadership of Prime Minister Keir Starmer, wasted no time in pledging their support. At the G20 summit, Starmer stood shoulder to shoulder with other world leaders. His message was clear, his tone unwavering. The UK, he announced, would double its military aid to Ukraine. This included, crucially, the provision of Storm Shadow missiles, long-range weapons capable of reaching deep into Russian territory. France, too, echoed these sentiments. President Macron, while urging caution, reaffirmed France's commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. French military aid, already substantial, would continue to flow, bolstering Ukraine's defenses and sending a clear message to Moscow: France will not stand idly by. The message from the West was clear: Ukraine would not stand alone. But this united front came at a price, a terrifying escalation that brought the world closer to the brink of nuclear war. In the halls of the Kremlin, the mood was icy. Biden's decision was seen not as a provocation, but as a declaration of war. Putin, his face a mask of cold fury, responded with chilling resolve. On November 19th, he signed a decree that sent shivers down the spines of world leaders. Russia, the decree proclaimed, would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if its existence was threatened. This was not empty rhetoric, not a bluff to be called. This was Russia's new nuclear doctrine, a terrifying document that laid out in stark terms the circumstances under which Russia would unleash its atomic arsenal. The doctrine was chilling in its clarity. Any attack on Russian soil, whether by Ukrainian forces or their Western backers, would be met with overwhelming force. This included, ominously, the use of nuclear weapons. The world, Putin warned, was playing with fire. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and a close ally of Putin, echoed these sentiments. Any attack on Russia, he warned, would be considered an attack by NATO itself. The consequences, he made clear, would be too terrible to contemplate. The world held its breath. The unthinkable, once a distant nightmare, now loomed large. The clock was ticking, each second bringing the world closer to a precipice. The stakes had never been higher. In Ukraine, the mood was a mixture of defiance and fear. Ukrainian soldiers, battered but unbroken, prepared for the inevitable counterattack. They knew they were outgunned, outmatched, but they would fight to the death for their homeland. In Washington, London, and Paris, diplomats worked feverishly, trying to avert disaster. The phones rang constantly, the air thick with tension. Every conversation, every telegram carried the weight of history, the terrifying possibility of a world consumed by nuclear fire. The world watched and waited, praying for a miracle. Could this nightmare be averted? Or was the world hurtling towards an apocalypse of its own making? Section 5. Biden's gamble: securing Ukraine or courting disaster. The weight of the world rested on Biden's shoulders. His decision to arm Ukraine with long-range missiles was a gamble, a desperate attempt to break the stalemate and force Russia to the negotiating table. But was it a gamble he could afford to lose? Biden's supporters argued that he had no choice. Ukraine was on the ropes, battered by relentless Russian assaults. Without a significant escalation, they argued, Ukraine would fall, and with it, the very idea of a rules-based international order. But critics argued that Biden had gone too far. By authorizing strikes on Russian soil, he had crossed a red line, provoking Putin in a way that could have catastrophic consequences. The risk of nuclear war, they argued, was simply too great. Biden, they argued, was playing a dangerous game, one that could have consequences far beyond Ukraine. The world held its breath, waiting to see if his gamble would pay off or plunge the world into chaos. Section 6. Trump's tightrope walk: Peacemaker or Warmonger. As the world teetered on the brink, all eyes turned to the United States. The upcoming presidential election took on a new urgency, its outcome potentially deciding the fate of the world. and no figure loomed larger in this geopolitical drama than Donald Trump. Trump, who had made a career out of upending expectations, had promised to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours if he was re-elected. But how exactly he planned to achieve this remained a mystery, a source of both hope and trepidation. Would Trump, the consummate dealmaker, be able to broker a peace agreement that satisfied both Russia and Ukraine, or would his unpredictable nature and admiration for Putin lead to concessions that emboldened the Russian leader and further destabilized the region? The world watched and waited, uncertain of what the future held. Trump, the self-proclaimed very stable genius, was now the wild card in a game with the highest possible stakes. Section 7. The world holds its breath, a nuclear sword of Damocles. The specter of nuclear war hung over the world like a sword of Damocles. The unthinkable, once confined to the realm of science fiction, now seemed terrifyingly real. The doomsday clock, a symbolic timepiece that measures humanity's proximity to global catastrophe, had never been closer to midnight. In capitals around the world, emergency hotlines buzzed with activity. Military commanders were on high alert, their fingers hovering over the buttons that controlled arsenals capable of unimaginable destruction. The world held its breath, praying that cooler heads would prevail. But the rhetoric was escalating, the threats becoming more explicit. The danger was not just that one side would intentionally launch a nuclear attack, but that a miscalculation, a misunderstanding, could trigger a chain of events that spiraled out of control. The world watched and waited, hoping against hope that the nightmare would end before it began. But the truth was, no one knew how this would end. The future, once a source of hope and anticipation, was now a terrifying unknown. Section 8. The fog of war, uncertainty reigns supreme. In the fog of war, truth is often the first casualty. Rumors swirled, disinformation spread like wildfire, and fear became the dominant emotion. The world, bombarded with conflicting narratives, struggled to make sense of the unfolding crisis. Was this the beginning of World War III, a global conflict that would dwarf all previous wars in its scale and brutality? Or was it a dangerous but ultimately manageable crisis, one that could be resolved through diplomacy and a healthy dose of common sense? No one knew for sure. The experts offered their opinions, the politicians made their pronouncements, but the truth remained elusive. The only certainty was uncertainty, the chilling realization that the fate of the world hung in the balance. The world, accustomed to instant information and easy answers, was confronted with its own ignorance. The fog of war had descended, obscuring the truth and leaving humanity to grapple with the terrifying unknown. Section 9. A plea for peace. Can sanity prevail? In this darkest of hours, as the world teetered on the brink of annihilation, a single question echoed in the hearts of people everywhere. Can sanity prevail? From the streets of Kyiv to the halls of the United Nations, a chorus of voices rose in unison, pleading for peace. Ordinary people, weary of war and fearful for their future, demanded that their leaders choose dialogue over destruction, diplomacy over devastation. Could this groundswell of popular sentiment, this desperate yearning for peace, be enough to avert disaster? Could it penetrate the fog of war, the entrenched ideologies and the political calculations that had brought the world to this perilous precipice? The answer, as always, lay in the hands of those with the power to wage war or forge peace. The world held its breath, praying that they would choose wisely, that they would heed the cries of their people and choose life over death, hope over despair.